affect pharmaceutical companies. So as Hutch said, it's the Pharmaceutical Records and Information Management Organization. And we're here to talk to you today about records and information management issues more generally that we think will be broadly applicable to most people. But in PRIMO, we have a narrower membership in that we are pharmaceutical companies are our members. This is a group, a consortium that was started to tackle those issues that are sort of unique to pharma, although, as you might imagine, many of the issues that we end up tackling are ones that affect all organizations, whether you're private or public. Our consortium was started in March of 2013. March of 2013. We are about 10 years old, and we currently have 25 member companies. And our whole focus is really about identifying sort of best practices, quality-driven, legally compliant approaches to common records and information management issues. And we do that by bringing together stakeholders from our member companies. So two of those stakeholders have joined us today. Like Hutch said, Donna Hayes, who is our current PRIMO chair, and Brett Wise, who is one of the members of our planning committee. And we really just go about tackling issues in a very thoughtful and considered way, using our board of directors to sort of guide us strategically. And right now we're focused on everything from automated disposition of electronic records to simplification of triggers, and also broader topics like global record retention requirements. We come at things very comprehensively, so we're not only focused on those records unique to pharma. We actually look at records and information across the board. So I think we want to kind of kick off today. We know you all have been focused on sort of thinking about how things have changed, what we all encountered, and we thought maybe it would make sense to kick off today sort of thinking about how the shifts in the way that we work presented a lot of challenges, right? And we were all confronted with those challenges pretty dramatically in March of 2020. So Donna, I'll start with you, just thinking back to March of 2020 and when we were sort of confronted with these new realities, when we had safety protocols we had to suddenly adopt, when we had a massive shift to remote work for many organizations. Maybe you could speak to a little bit about, what you confronted and what we discussed in PRIMO as an organization.
Sure. So one of the things that I think really jumped out at me at the beginning of all of this, because it had a direct impact on my own team, was the fact that we still were operating under processes using wet signatures for approvals. And quite frankly, we were in the process of revising our retention schedule, and that approval process was a wet signature process. And so when we entered into into the process of doing the approval, the first question is, well, how are we going to do this, right? And so, maybe people can print it and then scan their signatures. Well, not everyone had that capability. Okay, well, what about digital signatures? Well, not everybody was already set up for that. And we were not operating in an electronic document management system for the retention schedule. And our organization was really in the midst of a major implementation of a new document management system. So they were just being bombarded already with trying to deal with doing this remotely as they're migrating massive amounts of documentation into the system. And so we had to go through this process of negotiation just to get some flexibility to say, we've been down this path to get this retention schedule approved and implemented. And if we can't get it approved, we can't implement. And so all of this planning that we had done for a year is just gone. And so, we really had to negotiate some flexibility into that process. And and do some things on our own that normally would be handled through the process. And we said, oh, well, if you allow us to come in early to do this, we will do these other things so that you don't have to do that work. And so we got the buy-in for that. But then we said, oh, well, all of our approvers have to be trained in the system, have accounts, so we have to go through that process. And so it was really one of the lessons learned for me. It was just an eye opener of how many processes, not only our team but across the board, we're still operating in either hybrid systems or fully, wet ink signature processes that are no longer going to be appropriate as we continue to move forward and people are working from home, either, from here on out, or at least working from home a majority of the time and being able to get this stuff taken care of.
Yeah, and I think we'll revisit that use of electronic signatures. I know that that was a very
Mm.
common sort of scramble for a lot of folks. Another one I know that we confronted as records and information management professionals was all of these new sort of record types that emerged, right? And the question of, do we handle these uh, as new record types that need a new classification? How do we classify them in our existing schedules? And sort of the challenges that we were confronted in that respect regarding classification.
Yeah, we had that as well. I mean, one of the big things that we ran into, actually, Lilly created a testing facility during this period, and so we were really good at spinning up processes and ways to solve problems very quickly. And one of the things that really hit home for me is, again, a lesson learned from a couple of things in our ability to spin up a process and solve a problem, is that we've created this testing facility, and originally it was for our employees, and we reached out to healthcare workers and first responders, and then eventually opened it up to the community. And so there were lots and lots of records and lots of data generated as part of this process. And so one of the things that really jumps out is the fact that not only are we creating a lot of records, we're creating a lot of records that we hadn't historically had. I mean, we've never been a testing facility before, and so how do we manage that? And the thing that strikes me, more common than not, beginning to kind of create a pattern here when I start to think back on it, is that these things were done and they're great, but records management was left out of the discussions in this at the start of it. So now 2 years later, it's, oh, here's 2 years of information, Donna, what do I do with it? And so that kind of springboards the question that says, well, maybe we should be part of the discussions earlier on, even if the answer is you're still going to create everything you created. We have time to understand what are the regulations around it and start putting something in place to help manage it when we come out on the other end. And then the other thing that really struck me is, not only did we have that space and create these new records, and now I need to figure out what are we going to do with them. Just something as simple, and not just for our company, but I mean, a lot of my friends, I hear, stories about their companies where they had to go someplace and someone took their temperature and they wrote it down. And question like, well, Donna, what are they doing with that? Don't ask me. I don't know what they're doing with it. But then, think about, well, we're doing it too. And so, again, now we have 2 years worth of that data, and it's, well, now what do I do with it? And I think the real question that we need to continue to ask, and discussions we need to have, is when we have something new that comes around, or something we think that we need to do, and it might be the right thing to do, and it's great that we're doing it, but let's think about it in advance before we start creating documents, before we start collecting data and storing it somewhere. And that is, well, why are we gathering it, and what are we going to do with it, and what do we do with it later? And one of the biggest examples is taking your temperature at the door, and then, I know from our perspective, we took the temperature, And then they, was being written on kind of that security log of entry. Well, that security log had a specific requirements around retention. Well, now you've added this piece of information. What does that do, right? Does that create new requirements for it? And especially then you start thinking about, well, is that medical information, right? Is that health information? What is that you just wrote on that document? And really, so when I continue to think about some of the things we've done and say, well, let's think about this, the next round of something that happens that we need to do something new and different, trying to get into that conversation, or at least trying to get people trained to think that, why am I doing this, right? Why am I collecting that? Do I need to document it, right? Or can I document a process that says, in order to come through our door, your temperature has to be X or less. If it's more than that, you'll be told you can't come in. And then just follow that process and take the temperature, yes or no, in or out, done. Don't write it down. Don't create this other record that now, has potential issues down the road. And really trying to get people to think about that. Why are you collecting it? What are you going to do with it? Do you need to document it, or is it a decision-making process in the moment and it's over?
And Brett, I'm going to bring you in because I know
things that are pressing for me right now and dealing with those things.
Absolutely. And Brett, I'm going to bring you in because you've got some experience with this as well, evaluating, how are we dealing with some new information types? What is a record?
Yeah. So we were in a situation, and I can disclose this because it's very public. So Biogen had a conference back in February of 2020, in late February, and it was a leadership conference. So we had leaders from our company, well, all from our company, but from across the globe. And this was sort of at the beginning of COVID, certainly the beginning for the US. And we had taken precautions, but despite those precautions, it ended up that I believe someone from Europe had brought the virus over to the leadership conference, and then it spread some more, and then people left the conference. And before we realized a few days later what had happened, we had people going back across the US. And so what did they call it? What was the phrase that they used for those?
Spreader event.
Yes, exactly. And there was actually a large paper, I think, drawn up on this particular conference. But yeah, so we had a spreader event, and so we were early into, okay, how do we deal with all this information? Because as March rolled on and we shut down on-site work for a lot of employees, we eventually had to figure out, what do we do with all the testing as you come back onto campus, and attestations and temperature readings, as Donna brought up, and what are the retention requirements for it. We also had to deal with testing some of our own employees, and where did it cross the line between being medical records, and how do we account for that. So I did a lot of research, reached out to some of our outside counsel, did other research, and we didn't end up creating any additional record groups. We were able to use the record groups we had from our existing retention schedule, but we did have to figure out, I don't have it in front of me, but I probably had 10 to 15 different categories of data that we were collecting and how it maps to our retention schedule. And so one of the things that I had to do is I was working across different departments at Biogen, with HR, with legal, with information security, and the business units itself, on not only trying to confirm how we were going to manage that data we were taking in, but also getting the message across to everyone that was involved in, as we brought this data into our systems, or didn't bring it into the systems, making sure everyone was informed so that they were aware of what the retention requirements were, and so that we could execute upon that. So it certainly was a challenge, because as I was doing research, and maybe some of you in the audience came across this too, is basically what I kept being told, especially when I talked to legal, is we have no guidance on this because there's been no litigation on it. Here's best practice. California, of course, sort of led the way with some of the best practice. And so I would say at Biogen, we were probably more or less risk averse than others. We erred on the side of caution. And so we were pretty strict about what we were collecting and how long it should be retained for. And we were careful and the steps we took to make sure that some of the data didn't become medical records that didn't need to be. An example is we had to be careful who was taking the temperatures, because if it was a licensed medical professional, then it probably was a medical record, even if you didn't jot the temperature down. But if it wasn't a licensed professional, if it was our security people or whoever, then it wasn't necessarily a medical record. So yeah, so all of that went into that. And for Biogen, we had to be kind of careful because we were in the public light because of the incident back in February again. So we wanted to make sure that we were sort of a role model on how we were managing that information.
Yeah, and it occurs to me that this is really a great example. I think, Donna, you mentioned, right, how all these things were happening and they were happening very quickly, and had been consulted, perhaps some of the challenges down the road could have been avoided. And so, I know one of the things that we do a lot in PRIMO, and certainly we encourage people to think about, is how you can get involved in those conversations and get on people's radar and become part of, decision-making teams, whether those are information governance teams, whether they are core M&A deal teams, whatever it is. It's always good to make sure that you're a part of the conversation as much as you can. And to the extent that you don't have a seat at the table, make sure that somebody who does, for example, your general counsel might, or if you sit in, more in your IT function, somebody, your CISO or your CIO knows these issues and is thinking about these issues and bringing them to the table. One of the things we were aware of that I think was very common was most folks, had they not already rolled out something like Teams or Google Suite or a collaboration platform, we're in the process of considering doing so. And when we had this rapid shift to remote work, what we saw is that ability to sort of have that strategic thinking and collaboration had to just be completely accelerated, right? And in many cases, even if you decided, well, we can't decide this right now, we have to decide later what to do. From a records and information management standpoint, that in itself is a decision, right? Because if you're not configuring things to auto delete, then you've made the decision that at this time we're going to be, keeping this forever, right? And I don't know if the two of you really had that experience of that sort of rapid rollout, but I know that that was something that a lot of people struggled with, in addition to many other, just operational challenges of all of a sudden going from having most people come to an office to having most people work from home.
Yeah, we were actually using Teams, but it was more of, it wasn't widely being used, right? So my organization sits under IT, so we become part of the guinea pigs for all the things that we do. Right? IT is their own guinea pig, and so we become part of that. And so we had been using Teams, and even with our own individual team, uptake of the use of Teams, is a gradient. And so, yeah, there was just this huge, push and a lot of work and a lot of hours on our IT organization to get the capability to really build and beef up that capability, so that, all 40,000 workers have the ability to be on Teams. And so one of the things that we ran into was, okay, now we have all these people on Teams. Hey, look at this feature. Look at what I can do. Oh, and now you've just created this. And really then diving into, okay, you've got the, IM capability, right? Your chats and then your file storage and all of the other things that then can be connected into it. and really trying to put our arms around what guidance is going to go out. Is it becoming a free for all because we're kind of in this urgent situation? And I think for me, that's the kind of the big issue I see with any kind of a rollout, right? Great, you can do it. The ask from me is, should you do it, right? And what parts are the appropriate thing to do, and what things are we creating a bunch of mavericks to go do whatever they want, right? Under the guise of, we need to be able to communicate during this period of time while we're at home. And so really trying to wrap our arms around that and be, again, part of that discussion that says, yes, we need to do this, but we need to put some limitations around it. We need to understand what we're creating and be able to deal with it later, or help us figure out IT, how we do this now, so that we're not creating a big problem at the end of it.
And Brett, do you have thoughts on what the most effective messaging is when trying to communicate that, right? Because we never want to be seen as hampering the business and what they need to do, especially during a challenging time. And I know you've got experience in more than one industry, sort of trying to communicate these messages.
Yeah, so our experience was very similar to Donna's. We were literally, when COVID hit in February of 2020, we literally were rolling out Teams. We were replacing Skype, which I think many people were doing, and then bringing in Teams. So we were literally rolling it out. So when that happened, we fast tracked it, of course, and I'm part of IT as well. So we were guinea pigs, but everyone at Biogen became a guinea pig very quick. I think I can't remember for sure, but I think we pretty much went to Teams almost immediately. But I do remember during that time frame, probably February to April or February to May, we had lots and lots of meetings on planning committees about what you're asking about, Amy, what the requirements were going to be for Teams as far as security, retention, privacy, et cetera, and making sure that it met the business users' needs, and that we had the transition over from Skype, which some people loved, not sure why, but they loved it, and making sure that those characteristics were still there. One big item of discussion was the retention of the messaging, the chats, and how long do we keep them? And there was one group who wanted to keep them forever, and it's my group are like, no, we don't keep them forever. We don't keep them for very long at all. And so there was a lot of discussion back and forth, and we had a couple of people from Microsoft who helped us out quite a bit, both from an advisory perspective, but also from a technical view as well. What was possible, what wasn't possible. Actually, I think we probably helped Microsoft, tweak their products some as we brought requests to them, and they said, no, we can't do that. Let's see if we can figure it out. And so the messaging was, I think Biogen did a pretty good job of using the various mediums that we had to roll out the product, and at the same time say, this is what it can do, and here are what you can do with it. Here's what you can't do with it. Here's how long the messages are going to be there. A lot of this was done through training. There was video training, obviously not in office training for the most part, but video training being done, many sessions of that, many sessions on different aspects of Teams, and a repeated discussion of that was, especially around retention. How long are these things being kept? Here's the security and privacy implications of it. So I think training and Biogen in general did a good job of rolling all of that into the message. I've been part, not really of Biogen, but other organizations where attempts like that, rollouts of new systems and messaging wasn't done as effectively. But I think we did a pretty good job for Teams. Now one of the challenges we have as time has gone on is the magnitude of Teams and the Microsoft Online and all the components. Like the other day, I found out, actually it was from a PRIMO questionnaire that went out about whiteboarding. And I found out, as I dug into what we're doing with whiteboarding, that no, there is no retention period, because the data is kept in a separate repository that the end user has control of. So there is no built-in retention periods for that. So that's something we're digging into. But just like Microsoft pushes out these updates to the online version overnight, doesn't always educate or communicate very well what's going on, what the changes are. So we always have to adapt to that from a governance perspective, security perspective, just an IT perspective, from an end user perspective. So it's always with Microsoft Teams and Microsoft Online, it's always trying to stay ahead of the game, or at least keeping your head above water in terms of governance.
Yeah, it's hard to believe it was 2 years ago. It was a fire drill. I mean, now we're 2 years down the line. None of this is a fire drill anymore, right? We've got this expanded use of collaboration platforms. One of the things I thought we could revisit maybe is this expanded use of electronic signatures, right? I know that was also a common, major pivot point, and it affected records and information management. And that I think a lot of folks came to you all to say, can we even use an electronic signature for this particular record type? Donna, I think, did you want to share a little bit about some of the things that you fielded and dealt with?
Sure. Just, from the very basic, we don't have a way to do it. How do we get there, right? We've got, different organizations that, they're not a part of they haven't rolled out any kind of a electronic document management space. And we don't have an overarching, or haven't had an overarching space for, everything. So what do we do? And I think one of our biggest issues is we were in the midst of rolling something out, and so they're in this major migration space. All right. And so it begins to, okay, if we can't do this, what do we do? Right. And so really start diving into, I think one of the things that we found was like, okay, you're signing this. Is there, first starting to ask that question, do you need to sign this? Right. That was, I think, one of the biggest things is it something that requires a signature? And let's dive into that. I think for the most part, we have, our GXP systems, right? Those kinds of things. They were already in spaces that were having electronic signatures in inappropriate appropriate spaces. And but other areas of the company were saying, well, I really questioning, do I need to sign this? And I think one of the things was you start to see some jaws dropping, and they go, well, what do you mean I don't have to sign it? Well, do you or don't you? Right? It became this a large part of history that says, oh, well, I have it signed because my management needs to know I did it, or we need to make sure that management is okay that we're doing this. But do you have to? And I think that was something that people, I don't think, ever thought of before, that historically we signed this document, therefore it means we must have to sign this document. But we were able to look at some things and go, well, maybe we don't need to do that, and dive into that. And I think that wound up being good, because then, in addition to not having to then deal with that, finding a way to have that signed electronically, the other thing it did was it sped things up for people. Like, oh, if I don't have to have this done, I can move on and a different way. I can get an okay, because that's all it really meant. But for other areas that actually had to have them, it was really some negotiations and trying to figure out, well, how do we do this earlier, or what can we do in the meantime, working with our quality folks in some instances to help us to say, it just, we logistically can't do this right now. What do we do? And just trying to find a way that said, okay, well, do we have enough bandwidth for other areas to help take it on, even though that's not really what they were doing with that system? Can we beg, borrow, and steal, into a different system? Can we find ways that say, okay, we're not going to sign it now, but we've got maybe approvals through email or for some other channel, that then once we're back into the office, there will be an overarching signature with these things that are backing up that said you could do it and when it said you could do it. So all kinds of things of really just trying to figure out what you can do in the moment, that has integrity. Really, I mean, that's the key, right? It has integrity. Whether you can sign that today or you sign it tomorrow, do you have documentation trail that allows the indication of what that signature meant?
It's interesting to think about how, everything was a challenge, right? But some of those challenges led to silver linings and simplification of workflows and some improvements. Another challenge I know a lot of people confronted was for their paper records. It used to be, you would ship out and request retrieval of paper boxes, and everything was going to your centralized company location. I know of a lot of folks who got requests saying, I need to have this box of records sent to my house, right? And and I think if any of that got channeled to a records or information management person, they were quick to say, hold on, especially depending on the record type, like that's not appropriate. We can't do that. So having to sort of rethink not just relationships with your physical third-party storage providers, but also your electronic, records management providers or vendors. Brett, what were some of the lessons learned that you had and new ways of working that you found in this space?
Yeah, so to my knowledge, we didn't have anyone have records delivered to their house. The topic came up once or twice, but at least in the US, the addresses in our records management system that controls all that with our vendor, I have control over all of that. So as far as I know, no one had their personal addresses as an option to deliver boxes, but the topic did come up in some of our global affiliates. Hopefully that didn't happen. But yeah, so luckily for us, we were heavily electronic. Being part of the industry, we are the pharma industry. There is a certain component of what we do where we still have physical records. But many of those, especially ones that are in active use, we have a digital copy of those as well. So we don't normally, unless it's for an audit, have a lot of traffic back and forth of physical records. So one of the things that did happen to us that impacted us some, but it's certainly, like when I worked in the law firms, we dealt with a lot of paper records. So if I would have still been in a law firm, this would have been a much bigger impact on us. But one of the things that did happen is about the time, not long after the pandemic hit, is our vendor, our offsite storage vendor, came to us and changed the delivery schedule on us. So I think at one time we had stops at our main office in Cambridge, maybe 3 days a week. And the vendor came to us and basically told us that the schedule going forward is 1 day a week, and it would not be a set, well, it was a set day, but it wasn't a set stop. They would only come when something was requested to be picked up or delivered. So that was a little bit of a change, but didn't really impact us much because we didn't have many people on site to begin with to either receive the boxes or to go through the boxes. So, but that was, if we would have had a heavier volume of paper going back and forth, that would have definitely been an issue. One of the things that we did, especially for HR, primarily for HR, is we expanded the use of imaging on demand, pulling documents from boxes offsite, scanning them so that they were available. I know for our R&D folks, and probably for our manufacturing staff as well, they probably came on site more often than other hybrid staff to deal with some requests for paper records, especially audits. But so now we are today, and actually just recently I've been needing to negotiate with our offsite vendor because we are consolidating one of our existing buildings into another building. So of course we're having to do a clean out of all that content. And so we're going through a lot of records are going off site, and that 1 day on demand pickup is not going to work anymore. So I had to go back to our vendor and negotiate having, what we ended up with is 2 days a week, and it still isn't an automatic stop. We still had to put in the request, but even that, because the vendor had gotten into their pattern and they'd staffed for their new schedules, they weren't staffed to add additional days into the normal pickup schedule. So I had to negotiate that with them. And certain, for those of you out there that deal with paper records coming back and forth much more often, you've probably come across this as well, as it's you probably had to sit there and negotiate with your vendor on how to maintain or maybe modify your daily operations as far as offsite goes. So it's I would say one thing for us is it made us focus a lot more on efficiencies of managing our offsite content, and that's probably a plus. I think we've been able to improve efficiencies both in operational, but also in cost, in a cost perspective as well.
One of the things that we ran into with this, same kind of issues, right? You've got reduced people on site, reduced people at the vendor. And when I looked at our process, we have a third vendor involved, or second vendor involved for the transportation, right? So you're trying to put all this logistics in place in order for you get it pulled, you get it transported. There's someone to receive it. The requester is there to get to it. But what it really did is start to open some eyes as part of the conversations to the requesters. It's like, well, let's just have it scanned. Well, that's not negotiated into the contract that's serving you, right? And that's not going to happen overnight. And so finding, other ways to deal with it. But I think the bigger thing that came out of it for us is having those conversations and seeing the light bulbs go off to the individuals who are requesting it, that says, okay, here's this instance, and if it had been digitized, you'd have had access to it. So there's nothing we can do about what happened historically, but let's think about what maybe you're still generating in paper that we need to adopt an electronic process for. And if that's not feasible in the short term, let's think about, what things you might need to have scanned when you send it, right? Or, think about different ways, right? And then look at the historical stuff. We also had this knee-jerk reaction that said, well, we need to digitize everything. Okay, well, let's have that conversation. And so it really opened up an opportunity for some good conversations with different business areas to help them see that, yes, there's a time and a place and a use to digitize your historical stuff, but it's not always wholesale. Or, let's take a look at, what makes sense. And especially when you start showing them the price tag, then they start paying attention and say, oh yeah, maybe we're not going to do it all. But start thinking about what are those things that become more critical. What are those things that we really need to have, not just because I need to have it, but I need to be able to share that across the water, right? And so to have those conversations, to get people thinking about it, so that, now as we're going back to the office and people are coming back to that third party vendor, now let's start maybe negotiating some scanning projects for those things that, okay, if we have to lock back down again, if we have to go back into, we run into this again, we run into, something else that creates a situation where maybe the people that need to see it aren't where it is. What are those critical things, and maybe get those things digitized and understand then how we also will manage those digital forms moving down the road. So I think it's opened up some conversations and actually a very good, eye opener to a lot of the people in the business areas is, oh, we just can't do it because we want to. We can't just say, scan it for us and it's going to happen. That we weren't prepared in a lot of the markets to have that it wasn't in their contracts to be able to do it.
Yeah, it's one of the hardest things to do in the midst of a challenge, right? is to look at what are the opportunities that this challenge is presenting me as somebody who's trying to drive a strategy that maybe isn't easily understood by the C-suite or, you know, the business, right? Or might be, you know, somewhat, there might be some tension between, you know, sort of their goals and the goals of the program, right? To your point, well, we want to do this and it serves our business needs. So, you know, can't we just do it? Right. And sort of using the challenges of the moment as an opportunity to explain, well, actually, no, like on an enterprise, you know, yes, and for this one particular request, that's fine. But in totality, if we said yes to everyone, we'd completely deplete all our resource, you know, we would be operating at a deficit in terms of resources to be able to serve everybody's needs. So we have to be judicious in how we dole out those resources. And really getting folks to sort of recognize and think about that. And in some ways, it's harder in moments of challenge to do that. And in some ways, it's easier because sometimes the answer is just, look, we're not in a position to do this right in this moment. And actually, we all need to come together and talk about how are we going to strategically dole out these resources? How are we going to prioritize what's most important in this moment? You know, when everybody's, you know, sort of trying to deal with a lot of things all at once that are new.
I think one other thing that the global pandemic, because it was global as far as offsite storage brought up, was the different service levels or service options across the globe. While I had a pretty good handle on the US, even though we had the same vendor across the globe, those countries are sort of managed independently. And so some of the accommodations that we could arrange with the vendors in the US weren't always there for us in the other countries where we operate. So that was a challenge, you know, requesting records from offsite, sending records offsite in a timely manner. That was the biggest issue, is getting it done in a timely manner. And most of these records were being requested for audit purposes. So time is of the essence there. And it was frustrating to me because even though I have wonderful relationships with my account management with my vendor here in the US, and they have some reach across the globe to their colleagues or affiliate entities, they can't tell those other countries what to do. And so it was certainly that was something that identified to me an objective to improve upon over time. And then we've been working on that. We're actually looking at possibly doing a global, a sort of a global contract and trying to improve some of those relationships across the globe going forward.
And I don't know that everybody in the audience has, you know, the same experience with audits as folks in pharma, but I know that could be a separate panel in and of itself. So if anybody wants to talk about that at another time, I know we definitely had some PRIMO conversations about sort of lessons learned from trying to support regulatory audits in what could be best described as a hybrid, you know, a dynamic, ever-changing hybrid situation of folks on the ground. You know, one of the things that we keep doing in PRIMO, sort of thinking about, we're constantly doing this, right? Anybody who's been doing this for a while knows that we've had to pivot at several different points, right? There was the pivot from paper to electronic. Now we're dealing with sort of pivoting from most people working in an office to, you know, we've heard a variety of things, right? Some companies, almost nobody's coming back. Some companies, everybody's expected to come back, but only part of the time. Some companies are being much more aggressive in bringing people back to the office. All of these things are going to continue to pose challenges for anybody who's in charge of a company's data, information, or records. So I know one of the things that we've done in PRIMO is sort of try to think about, okay, how can we both anticipate, you know, sort of what's coming, right? So we can be best positioned to serve our organizations, but also so we can be best positioned professionally to deal with the challenges that are going to come our way And another conversation we've been having a lot is sort of the rising profile of data governance and how we can maybe team up with some of our data governance folks in our organizations to see where there is overlap. And actually, we're going to be doing this at our upcoming PRIMO board meeting, where we sort of sit down and try to get a better sense of, okay, how is data governance function and RIM function complementing each other? And where do they really have separate areas of responsibilities? And all of this, it becomes ever more important just because of the dynamic regulatory environment that everybody's operating in. We were invited to join you guys today because as pharmaceutical companies, you know, there is a very common experience amongst everybody of being in a highly regulated environment, needing to do really precise records and information management programs and having a good program in place. That's becoming a bigger issue for everyone because these new regulatory frameworks that we're seeing have a much broader reach. It's not just affecting one industry anymore, right? If you have somebody's personal information, you have to care about the privacy regulations that are happening in California, in Virginia, in Colorado. If you are in an insurance space, you have to care about how the state legislatures in those states are starting to consider regulating use of algorithms and artificial intelligence. And so one of the things that we're, I think, all challenged with, but we'll best do when we speak to each other is sort of figure out, okay, how can we think about these different things as, you know, how can we sort of find these common areas to work together? And how do we, you know, kind of take some of these rising profiles, right? Like the rising profile of data governance and maybe hitch our wagons to that a little bit, right? Distinguish ourselves, but still sort of piggyback on some of these things that are getting a lot of attention right now.
We have some good questions for you guys. Are you ready? With the rollout of 365 Teams, have you implemented a retention schedule with that?
So for us, we don't have a retention schedule specifically for teams. Okay. It's about what is being managed, right? So within teams, right? There's you know, certainly from a collaboration space, the expectation in our organization is that that's where you're collaborating, but that final product, depending on what it is, then gets moved to the appropriate repository that's already in place. That already is managing the life cycle of the document. So it becomes the collaboration space, and then you move it. For things that are less formalized or more of the team documents, like, you know, like my team, we have, you know, some guidance for ourselves, or, you know, here's our how-tos for certain things. Those things are being managed within the SharePoint behind the team space, you know, with you know, much quicker turnaround from a destruction standpoint. So that's how we're managing.
Yeah, and I would say for us, the answer is yes and no. We have retention periods around Teams messaging. So I think ours is 30 days. And after that, the chat messaging goes away. But content that is created defaults to SharePoint sites. And for us, a SharePoint site is not technically an official repository for records. It's more of a sort of intermediate stage at the end of, well, at some point you need to move it to an approved repository. And for regulated content, we're not supposed to store any regulated content at all on SharePoint sites. So for teams, we don't, it's not part of our retention schedule, but it is covered under our electronic communications policy, where most of the messaging is only retained for 30 days.
Awesome. Okay.
And I would say just generally, right, generally speaking, there is no one size fits all answer to these questions. Generally speaking, you know, and Donna and Brett both alluded to this, right? Teams is another platform, right? Like file shares, like any other sort of unstructured space. So you can put rules around it that are agnostic of the content, but then you need to make sure that you're training and instructing users on when that content's going to go away and if they have an obligation to move anything that is subject to record retention requirements to a different space, right? So really with these things, you can definitely use automation to make the management of the content easier, but there has to be training and communication to the users so that you are making sure that you keep anything that you need, and that it's not. And then of course you have to negotiate with the business because like Brett, you had mentioned earlier, right? Some people were like, well, we want to keep these chats forever. And so it can be a little bit of a tricky balance to strike in terms of, you know, managing that content in a way that makes sense for your legal and regulatory profile versus letting the business use the tool in a way that's helpful to them, right? It's great to have a really aggressive deletion policy in terms of sort of these more, you know, things like chats, if you've got the proper training in place. However, the business might say the whole point is that I want to be able to go back and see, you know, what we've talked about for the last month, not just the last 3 days. So, you know, there's definitely no one size fits all, and it's very prudent to, you know, consult with folks and make sure you're getting all the perspectives.
Awesome. Brett, as part of IT, how much do you think it's helped you getting your concerns communicated to IT with features like the whiteboarding limited or hidden?
Yeah, that's to me, correct, Hutch? Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a great question. Because you would think, well, you're part of IT, that makes everything easier. And I've been part of IT in most of the organizations that I've worked for. So there is an element of that. When you work in IT, you have closer relationships with your IT colleagues, you know them more one-on-one. So if it's not on the face of it, at least behind the scenes, you do have a little bit more political clout, whatever you want to call it. But at the end of the day, the information governance program, the records management program still does, it's not necessarily at the front of the line when budgets come around, and you know, for IT projects, we're not necessarily at the front of the line because IT projects cost a lot of money. We're not at the front of the line necessarily to get our projects funded. So it is working within IT does help accomplish some of my program's objectives from a technical perspective, but I find myself still having to advocate not only for funding, but also having to educate, especially the more technical divisions of IT, having to educate our IT staff on why it is important to apply retention to system data, and why it's important to put it in a repository that can manage retention instead of taking data that we can retain and dumping it into cold storage where in reality it would just sit forever. Why it's important putting governance around those and taking the time and sometimes the money, but certainly the personnel effort to make sure those things work. So yeah, it helps being in IT, but I will say that there are times that I would like to report up to legal because that would help my cause out some. But if I was reporting up to legal, there would be times I would want to work in IT to pull off some of the technology initiatives as well. So it has its pros and cons, I would say. As most of the people in this call would say, there's probably not a perfect fit for IG in any particular department.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think that fits anywhere. What tools have been successful for you to monitor risk related to electronic records being downloaded on personal devices or third-party cloud storage sites?
I think we're not going to talk specifically about tools so much today, but could you repeat the question again, and I'll try to answer from a general standpoint.
What tools have been successful for you to monitor risk related to electronic records being downloaded on personal devices or third-party cloud storage sites?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that's a great question. I know there are tools out there, and like I said, I don't think we're going to talk about anything specific, but Donna or Brett, if you have perspectives from a general standpoint.
What I will say is that, as with many organizations, Biogen is making a lot of concerted effort to improve its information security posture because of the time we live in. And one of the main targets or goals on our agenda right now is data loss prevention. So I can't necessarily speak to specific tools, but I can say that data loss prevention, which is what you're talking about, has the attention of not only IT senior management, but our senior leadership at the very top. They're very concerned about it. They want to make sure that our security posture in that sense is best in class, that it's as good as can be.
And I would say that data loss prevention DLP tools is one, kind of wagon to hit yourself to, because it is getting a lot of attention. I would say that that's a very, very ubiquitous topic right now amongst a lot of organizations. And it's a great way, because people are thinking about, the security is sort of another side of the coin, right? And good retention and disposition and being in compliance with your information governance and RIM policies can be part of that, a huge part, right? We always advocate that somebody can't breach, download, or take something that doesn't exist, right? And so it's actually a really beneficial way for the organization to say, we don't need this information anymore. Our policies say it should be gone. And it's one way to sort of drive proper deletion and disposition in your company.
And as you look for the right tool, DLP is a great tool, is a great concept, but it's not necessarily all encompassing. It doesn't necessarily check off all the boxes you'll need. So when you start talking to vendors about DLP tools, make sure you understand what you want your end state to look like, because you may need some supporting tools to work with that DLP software to accomplish what you ultimately want to do, information rights management, things like that.
And it's a really good exercise to consult with folks who are in your same industry. So, to the extent that you have colleagues at, organizations that you can reach out to talk about these issues, as you think about, what are our criteria for acquiring any type of tool, really, right? And to the extent you don't have your criteria included as part of the procurement process, that's another thing we would definitely recommend is, get information governance and records retention and deletion issues at the forefront of your IT procurement criteria if you can, and try to make that case, because it'll make your job infinitely easier down the line.
What best practice does PRIMO recommend for global records that may fall under scope of overlapping and conflicting retention triggers in multiple countries?
I'm happy to take a first stab at this. So one of the things that we've worked on in PRIMO for the last 10 years is a biopharmaceutical model records retention schedule. So we talk about that very issue, right? What do you do when you have records that are subject to conflicting requirements? Again, there's no one size fits all. We tend to try to take a big bucket global retention approach, and then we carve out jurisdictional exceptions to the extent that there is something different required. That's not the only way. That's kind of our primary approach for the PRIMO model schedule that we have.
Yeah, and I would add to that, add exactly to what she said, is understand where you operate, what you want to accomplish, because with the retention schedule that's global, you are going to have country exceptions. And I can tell you that we're experiencing this, and I'm sure my colleague organizations are experiencing this too, that the more country exceptions you create, the difficult it is to execute upon retention. If you have a records management system, especially for structured data, and you are trying to destroy data at different times based upon either different record groups or different country exceptions, it gets very difficult, if not impossible, to do that exactly in line with what your policy says. So you end up having to make accommodations and create risk exceptions for probably over retaining stuff and figuring out what's the best case scenario to do here. So it's difficult. I know some companies, I'm not so sure in the pharma industry, but just generally, if they are global, sometimes they'll create retention schedules for specific countries. I've never managed that, but I can imagine that has its own challenges. But yeah, having a retention schedule that cuts across the globe, it gets difficult, and you just have to, sort of strategize the best you can on what you want to accomplish and try to foresee the issues you're going to have and try to stay ahead of the game as far as not just what the policy says, but definitely my best advice would be think about actually executing upon your retention schedule and what that's going to look like and what the problems you're going to have, and try to stay ahead of the game. Because if you don't, and you get to the point where you have these problems and you're staring them in the face, it gets a lot harder to backtrack if you haven't planned in advance.
Yeah, and one of the things that we continue to deal with is the fact that, operating in a global company and operating depending on the record types, the information in one space is going to support a global, issue, or, a global launch of a product, or something like that. And so even though there may be a jurisdictional rule that is more stringent than the rest, we need to think about, well, if you carve out that jurisdiction, what are you doing to the bigger picture of the data? And does that, if you destroy that, then what happens, right? And specifically for the pharmaceutical industry, thinking about submissions and clinical data, right? If you can't get rid of this clinical data without destroying the whole submission. And so that winds up leading us down paths of conversations, with legal and with the legal folks across countries. And then again, like Brett said, really looking at what that risk profile is. And in many instances, having the conversation that says, yes, it says this, but if we do that, here's what happens. And we can't do that, right? We can't just throw away a product because we have, this regulation says get rid of this data. That we're going to have to keep it in order to keep the whole package together. And so you really need to dive into what is the implication if you did get rid of it. And then enter into discussions about risk with legal and potentially regulatory bodies.
And I think we're coming up on time, or we're at time, but I'll just add this really, I think, is very similar to what we were talking about earlier, where this is why governance and process around these things is so important, because granting one request is not a big deal, right? Creating one exception for a jurisdiction is not a big deal. But if you don't have a process or a set of criteria against which you're making these decisions and you're sort of granting them arbitrarily, what's going to happen is, like Brett said, all of a sudden, you can manage one country exception for one record type for one jurisdiction, no problem. But if you have 400 of those, you're really going to be faced with a significant challenge. So it's thinking about not just, can I satisfy this one request for an exception, or can I satisfy this one request for, digitization or something like that? It's, what is this going to look like when I zoom out and look at, every request I might get, and really thinking about that.
And document the decisions you make, because in the regulated industry, the auditors are going to look for consistency. You made this decision. Why did you make that decision? So if you have it documented, at least that's a step towards being defensible. Maybe even if it wasn't the best scenario or the best decision, if you document and you have some reasoning, you have a leg to stand on there. But if you are just arbitrarily making decisions here and there, and especially if you haven't documented, the auditor is going to focus on that. Why have you not been consistent in doing whatever it is you're doing?
Are there any other questions from anybody? Oh, these were awesome questions. All right, Hutch, I'm handing it back to you.
Okay, Eileen, thank you very much. And like I said before, content. That was great. And the questions were really great, were really fantastic. And the thing is that you realize that we're all in the same boat. And it's no matter what the industry, it's the same issue, same questions. And you just see the boat gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think so does the ocean. But once again, that was fantastic. And thank you very much. And so our next speaker coming up in just a few minutes at 1:30 will be Rob Mattern from Mattern Associates. So I think I'm going to take all the pressure off here and unspotlight.
Thanks,
or as it says,
everyone.
Yeah.
remove
Thank you,
spotlight.
everyone.
Thank you all very, very much. That was super informative. I really think that was fantastic. And we learned a lot.